Today, I want to do something fun and give out a grade to each Big Ten East team. I will be doing the Big Ten West in a later video, as I think it needs a different kind of analysis and maybe even a different kind of grading system, just given how chaotic it was. And the West Division, let's just face it, in reality was a lot worse than the East, and it was a lot more on equal footing than the East was. And to back up those 2 points with evidence, Illinois, one of the best teams in the Big Ten West, lost their 3 Big Ten East crossover games to Indiana, Michigan State, and Michigan. And the East had Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, which were the only Big Ten teams to finish ranked on the year. So if you want to listen to my rankings for the Big Ten West, the grade that I give each Big Ten West team, hit the notification bell so you can get notified when that video is released and when other content is released. This video will use a grading system that has 2 key components, the first one being larger than the second. The first is how well did each team do from a non-biased eye test. And by that I mean, if you go 4-8 and you have like the worst talent in the world, and you go 15-0 and you have the best talent in the world, it doesn't matter who has better talent or not. The 15-0 team is going to be viewed largely as having much more success and earning that success, regardless if the 4-8 team is held back by their success. Basically, what I'm saying is that strength of record, winning percentage, and where they finished will be in the first category. Points where every team is held on equal footing. If you go 6-7, but you're being held back by your talent, well, in that first component, that would be viewed as your responsibility. You're still a 6-7 football team. The second point is more on efficiency and more on, what did you achieve in terms of the team's own goals this season, which of course looks different for every other team. Those are not held on the same level playing field. For some schools, like Kansas, going to a bowl game basically gets you in that part of the grading system an A+, because they haven't gone bowling in 10 years. Whereas for Alabama or let's say Georgia, going to a New Year's Six Bowl and losing and finishing 10-3 or 11-2, you're not getting an A. At most, you will probably get a B+, maybe an A- if you're a really good team, but more likely than not, you'd fall in that B range, maybe even upper C range, depending on other results in your season. Those 2 things will be combined, and the average will be spit out, and that will be my grade. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new to the channel, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while and haven't subscribed, or if you're looking for just new college football content to watch from someone who brings quality content forward, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button. I have some outside help occasionally here and there. My cousin Jonathan has actually been very helpful to this channel. I want to issue a shout out to him. However, overall, I am the main and somewhat the only producer of content here. I'm the only one who uses the mic. I am, for the most part, a one-man army. So it would mean a lot to me and help keep this channel going if you could hit that subscribe button, watch this video and my others all the way through, like this video, and please comment your thoughts down below on what you think the Big Ten East will look like next season. Where will all the teams finish? What will their records be? And where would you have them ranked in your own top 25? Let's get right into it and start off with Rutgers. Rutgers, they finished last in the Big Ten East with a 4-8 record, and they were 1-8 in conference. They, like Indiana, who finished in 6th, started out 3-0, and then the freight train that Big Ten Conference schedule hit them, and they only won one other game, which ironically was against Indiana. I predicted Rutgers to go 4-8 and finish 6th in the Big Ten East. I had Rutgers unranked in the preseason. The Scarlet Knights, they went 4-8. They finished 7th in the Big Ten East. They obviously were not invited to a bowl game. Gavin Wimsatt, Noah Vedral, and a quarterback, I think it was Matt Simon. Maybe his first name wasn't Matthew, but they kept switching quarterbacks throughout the year. They brought in a lot of O-line from the portal after the 2021 season. Their offensive line and offense was still garbage. It's why they fired offensive coordinator Sean Gleason in the middle of the year. And they made a big hiring in Minnesota's OC, Kirk Shiraka, who's going back to Rutgers where he worked under Greg Schiano nearly a decade ago. Rutgers did regress, and they were just complete and utter garbage, getting blown out in most of their losses. They got shut out by Maryland. They led Michigan at halftime, then Michigan boat raced them. They actually got a lead on Ohio State because of a mistake by Ohio State, and Ohio State boat raced them. Even when given opportunities to win, and even when they were underestimated, they could never finish or close out an upset. They just couldn't do it. The Nebraska game is a prime example, too. They led 13-0 at halftime against a team who just fired their coach, just got blown out by Oklahoma, and Nebraska and Mickey Joseph outcoached them and came back and were the mentally tougher team. They regressed. They were terrible. I don't even know how they're going to succeed in the Big Ten over the next 2 years, which basically means I'm doubting whether Greg Schiano can get it done anymore. Maybe Rutgers is eternally damned to this. But yet Rutgers met expectations. So I have to give the Scarlet Knights a D+. If Rutgers had more talent, if their goals were much higher, I would give them a D, D-, heck, maybe even an F. That's how bad Rutgers was. They beat no one. No one. They beat Wagner. They barely beat Temple. Barely beat Boston College. Beat Indiana by a smidge. Those are all teams that have losing records or worse. And Wagner is an FCS school who got destroyed and shellacked by Syracuse. Moving on to Indiana. I predicted them to go 3-9. I actually predicted them to start 3-0, finish 0-9, and finish 7th in the Big Ten East. I had Indiana unranked in the preseason. I had them as the worst Big Ten team, and somehow Northwestern topped that despite beating Nebraska in week 0, but that's for another video. The Hoosiers went 4-8. They started out 3-0, almost and looked like, and probably should have, finished 0-9 at the end of the year, and by tiebreakers they then would have finished 7th, with Rutgers having the head-to-head win. But Michigan State and head coach Mel Tucker, special teams coach Ross Ells, and kicker Ben Patton had other plans. And that gave Indiana their 4th win. It probably kept Tom Allen from being fired, and they weren't invited to a bowl game. And now Indiana has to go through another round of half of their roster leaving the portal, that half of the roster being filled by backups from other schools, and really high ceiling and explosive group of 5 players. Quarterback Connor Bazelak hit the portal, and a star D lineman from Western Michigan, whose name I forget, is transferring there. AJ Barner, one of their better tight ends, or their best tight end, he's transferring to Michigan. So Indiana's roster is once again going through massive changes. Huge changes. Indiana was a team in the preseason that I thought could either bottom out and go 1-11, perhaps even worse. Perhaps they would fully hit the floor and go 0-12. But I also thought they had a potential to win 6 or 7 games. With Connor Bazelak, somewhat of an underrated wide receiver core, and that was proven in the fact that Jalen Lucas, who was the Big Ten's best returnman, that he exists. They have an underrated wide receiver core. Their secondary looked good in the preseason, same with parts of their defense. The main question, of course, was at offensive line, and Tom Allen's coaching and the coordinator coaching. He fired his O-line coach middle of the season, but I'm not a Tom Allen fan at all. I think it is proven that Kalen DeBoer, who was his offensive coordinator in the middle of his career, specifically in the 2019 season, where he coached Michael Penix to have an even better statistical year than in 2020, is what gave Tom Allen success at Indiana. Kalen DeBoer made the 2019 Indiana team with Peyton Ramsey and Michael Penix, and even though he left to coach Fresno State in 2020, the pieces, the scheme, it was all intact and laid out for offensive coordinator Nick Sheridan to take over and manage well. And the defense, people forget this, but it wasn't Michael Penix that made Indiana great in 2020. It was partially him, but it was more so Indiana's defense. I'm not a Tom Allen fan at all, but he upset Illinois and Michigan State. Illinois was 8-5. Michigan State, if he didn't upset them, would have went bowling, and he saved his job. And Indiana technically outperformed my expectations and did surprise people at the end of the year. In retrospect, they beat one of the better Big Ten West teams, and they did upset Michigan State on the road. So I give the Hoosiers a C- here. In fifth place, we have the Michigan State Spartans. I predicted Michigan State to go 8-4, finish tied for third in the Big Ten East, and I had them ranked number 19 in the preseason. So this is where this video begins to get interesting, because this was a ranked team. In the preseason, many people had MSU ranked higher than me. People were more inclined to have them go 9-3 or 10-2 compared to me, and I didn't buy it. Kenneth Walker was a huge part of their 2021 campaign. They had injuries at O-line. They lost some guys at O-line, and I just didn't buy it. I mean, Peyton Thorne, Jaden Reed, they were good. I thought they would still be dangerous, but you'd have to change the whole offense. And they lost their two best pass rushers in Drew Beasley and Jacob Panashuk after 2021. So even though their defense, I thought, was going to overall take a step forward, there would be areas in the defense that would still have weaknesses, still have cracks. And to a certain degree, I accurately guessed it, because more people had MSU ranked higher than I did, and MSU underperformed expectations. But they didn't just underperform at the national level. They underperformed according to my book. I thought Michigan State maybe could get to 10-2. I thought that 10-2, 9-3, 7-5, 8-4, that was the range MSU would be in. I had MSU losing on the road to Maryland before taking on Ohio State, and I had them losing the OSU game, the Michigan game, and I think one other game. I forget what that other game was, but anyway, it doesn't matter. They went 5-7. They finished fifth in the Big Ten East. They weren't invited to a bowl game. The Spartans had a ridiculously tough schedule. They faced Washington, Maryland, Minnesota, Ohio State, Michigan, Illinois, all those teams that I listed, and those were 5 of them had 8 wins or more. Oh, Penn State too. That's 6 teams with 8 wins or more. Penn State, Washington, Michigan, Ohio State, they faced 4 top 10 teams. They had a 2021 Nebraska type schedule. The difference was Nebraska played all those teams close. Michigan State didn't play any of those teams close except for Maryland, who they lost to by 7, I think, or maybe more than that. I think it was 13 actually, and Illinois, who they managed to beat. But they got blown out by every top 10 team they faced. Washington, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. Michigan State didn't even come close to achieving their 2022 goals. Peyton Thorne severely regressed. Their run game was non-existent, which actually is proof as to how good Kenneth Walker is, because their O-line performed at the exact same level it did last year, maybe a tad worse, and their run game went from one of the best in the nation at times to downright atrocious. Jalen Berger, nor Brassard, nor Collins averaged 5 yards per carry, and that's including the games where they got stat padded against group of 5 teams, and neither of them even got close to 1,000 rushing yards. So I give the Spartans a D-, which, if you haven't already guessed it, is the worst grading in the Big Ten East. No one's gotten an F because no one went 3-9, 2-10, or worse and went winless in conference, and no one fired their head coach. You kind of have to do both, or just have an absolute record down year for me to give you an F. And to get an A plus, you have to definitely be a part of the top 4, top 5, and you have to overachieve your expectations. Or if you don't overachieve your expectations, like you have to win the national title. Like if Alabama starts out ranked number 1 and they win it all, they get an A plus. It's kind of the logic behind that. Rarely you are going to see me give out an A plus or an F, since those are the extreme ends of the spectrum. Let's talk about Maryland. I predict them to go 7-5 and finish 5th in the Big Ten East, and I had Maryland unranked in the preseason. The Terrapins went 8-5. At times, they looked like a top 25 team, especially early in the season. But then Talia Tagovailoa got injured. Their offensive line really fell apart in November, and that was just the end of them being ranked. The complete end of that conversation. They went 8-5, and they finished 4th in the Big Ten East, having a 7-5 regular season record and losing all their games in conference to fulfill my prediction. And they won the Duke's Mayo Bowl. Mike Locksley has only beaten 2 teams that were ranked in the top 25 during his tenure at Maryland. That was Syracuse in 2019, who completely fell apart after that blowout win, and this game in the Duke's Mayo Bowl, where NC State was ranked in the fringe top 25. So good for Mike Locksley and Maryland for picking up that second top 25 win in his tenure there. The Terrapins had a lot of potential on offense, great wide receiver core. You had Dante Demas, Raheem Jarrett, Jacob Copeland, Jashawn Jones. That is really a loaded wide receiver core with limitless potential. And you also had Roman Hemby and Talia Tagovailoa, and an O-line that earlier in the year did play up to... They played to expectations, and they did better than last year. This Maryland team is the best team that Maryland has had since the Ralph Friedgen era. So in over 10 years. I mean, Maryland and Kansas this year, if you're looking at teams that, really have outdone themselves and what their past decade selves looked like, look at Maryland. Look at Kansas, teams that were in the bottom of their conference for a decade. And Maryland started climbing up last season. They did it again this year. And Kansas went bowling. So good, honestly, good for Maryland this year. They met my expectations, but they were inconsistent. This team, watching them early in the year, could have finished 9-4, and heck, I might even hate to say this, they could have finished 10-3. They could have beaten Purdue, they could have beaten Wisconsin. Those teams were shells when it comes to, they just were. They were shells when it comes to coaching, when it comes to talent, compared to Maryland. Wisconsin didn't have a head coach when they blew out Maryland. Purdue finished 8-6, and they were basically carried by 3 players on offense and a defense that was bipolar when it came to either being elite against the run or complete and utter garbage against it. So they were inconsistent. They could have played better in retrospect. This team had more potential power and more talent to it than even I thought in the preseason. And they won 8 games. So for that, for Maryland being close to a top 25 team, for them meeting my expectations, and a little bit of punishment for inconsistency, I give the Terrapins a B, which is a pretty solid grade for the position they are in historically and in the present in the Big Ten East. Up next, we have Penn State. Now we're getting closer and closer to the top. Penn State is a top 10 team. I predicted that they would go 7-5, though, and finish tied for 3rd in the Big Ten East, and I had them unranked in the preseason. I thought this was going to be a year where Penn State would just have to struggle for survival. They would have to get through with a winning record to keep James Franklin's, job security away from the hot seat, and that 2023 could be their breakout year, where they could, win 9-10 regular season games, maybe win their bowl game, and get on track for a huge year in 2024, where Aller, Singleton, and Allen and Dennis Sutton, the main components of that elite 2022 recruiting class, could have a few years in the program and really get things going at Penn State possibly. But no, I was a year or two off when it came to a breakout year for Penn State because the Nittany Lions went 11-2. They finished third in the Big Ten East, and they won the Rose Bowl and finished ranked number 7. And the Nittany Lions, when they traveled to Michigan, they were in it for a half from some perspective, though in reality, it was more that Michigan was playing slow. That game, when you look at it, Penn State was only in it because of anomalies and because they made plays that they could not replicate. They were fluke plays. But Penn State, talk about another game against a top 4 team, a top 4 team they actually competed with. In reality, it wasn't an illusion, was Ohio State. That was a game until the fourth quarter. Now, Penn State fell apart. Ohio State played one of the best fourth quarters that I've ever seen them play. So Penn State doesn't, I'm not going to reward them for competing with Ohio State more than they did with Michigan, especially seeing that Michigan was the best team in the Big Ten this season. However, the point is the fact that they could pull off statistical anomalies against a team that arguably should be the second best team in the country, a team that 9 times out of 10 would have beaten TCU, and the fact that they nearly beat Ohio State in Beaver Stadium, if you just look at the 3.5 quarters in which they played competitively with Ohio State. And then you look at Penn State, they return Nick Singleton, they return a lot of their O-line, they return Katron Allen, they return some of their tight ends. Drew Aller has been groomed this year for succeeding Clifford in that starting QB role, and they return some defensive players and most of their staff, and you realize that those 2 losses, those will be, viewed as points of growth for Penn State next year. And Penn State won all their other 11 games. They competed with and dominated a top 10 team in Utah. They beat the Big Ten West champions on the road at Purdue, in Ross-Ade Stadium. And they drastically exceeded my expectations. And they went 11-2 with a team that was young. They lost, remember, last year, they lost most of their defense to the NFL. Lost most of their team to the NFL. That's why they looked so bad in the Outback Bowl. And that's why James Franklin called that atrocious fake kick. I don't even remember what that play was, but it was just disgusting. I give the Nittany Lions an A. The only reason I wouldn't have gave them an A+ is because they didn't win their conference and they didn't finish in that top 4, top 5. But they get an A, which that's the highest, tied for first. That's the highest ranking that I'm going to give out in the Big Ten this season. So good on Penn State. They were successful this season, and they're going to be even better in 2023. And I think you can say the same for Ohio State, and heck, even the same for Michigan. With what Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan return, I do think all 3 will be better next year than their counterparts this year. I predicted Ohio State to go 13-0, finish first in the Big Ten East, win the Big Ten, and I actually predicted them to win it all. I just didn't do preseason bowl picks or preseason official playoff predictions. It's especially hard to pick who's going to win the playoffs in the preseason and who's going to win the bowl games, but I think I'm going to attempt to do that this season. We'll see. But I had Ohio State ranked number 1 in the preseason. I thought that this team would have by far the best offense in the nation and have a defense that was competent compared to last year, especially at secondary, to where they would just outscore their opponents, rely on teams making mistakes that their defense and Jim Knowles would capitalize on, and that they would win every game, probably in dominating fashion. Minus the Michigan game. I thought that Michigan was the only thing standing in Ohio State's way from winning the national title. The funny thing is, despite Ohio State going 11-2 instead of 15-0, part of my prediction was right. Michigan truly was the only thing standing in the way from Ohio State winning that national title, because they dominated Ohio State. They beat them by 22 points, whereas Georgia beat them by 1, and there's much debate as to the what-ifs of that Georgia game. Making the what-ifs of the Ohio State-Michigan game Michigan still wins that game like 6 or 7 times out of 10, probably. Just with the matchup, with how Michigan was mentally tougher, with the fact that Michigan's just better in the trenches. Michigan's better suited to play Big Ten football in November than Ohio State is. But in saying that, to Ohio State's credit, they're more built to win a national title than Michigan is because they have better athletes, they have more potential, their scheme is more modern, and that Georgia game, who knows? I mean, I would like to believe that game's pretty 50-50. Georgia obviously being the overall better team, but the matchup favors Ohio State despite Georgia having the better head coach, the better staff, and the better potential. Ohio State is built to beat a team like Georgia in the same way that Michigan, they don't have the same talent that Ohio State does. Some would argue Michigan might even have the inferior overall coaching staff. But here we go. Michigan is built from a matchup perspective to beat the Buckeyes. The Buckeyes went 11-2. They finished second in the Big Ten East for the first time since before divisions were even invented. Ohio State didn't even finish tied for first in their division. But they went to the college football playoff and finished ranked number 4. They once again lost to Michigan, which stinks, but they nearly beat Georgia. And if they beat Georgia, they blow out that TCU team from the performance that TCU put on that night. That wasn't just Georgia being mentally locked in. That was also the fact that, let's face it, Michigan wore down TCU despite losing. Because when you have the depth that TCU has, and you have to face back-to-back top 10 opponents, you're going to get worn down. So Ohio State, I give them a B+, which might surprise a lot of you, but they were a top 4 team. They nearly won it all, and they dominated and looked better than the Michigan team. They dominated their other conference opponents, and they actually looked better. I mean, seriously, they looked better before the game actually happened. They looked like the better team. They dominated their in-conference schedule better than anyone else in the Big Ten did. Except for, again, that final game, which just shows you how important matchups are and how important trench play and mental toughness are. And speaking of trench play and mental toughness, here we are with Michigan, the number 1 team in the Big Ten, the number 1 team in the Big Ten East. I predicted them to finish where Ohio State did this year, basically. If Michigan was to go into the playoff after going 11-1, I thought that maybe they could win a playoff game. Maybe they could win it all despite being 11-1, which in retrospect, Ohio State had that same potential. Or they'd, barely lose that semifinal, finish 11-2, losing in the semifinal. So basically, Michigan and Ohio State this year swapped places from where I had them in the preseason. It's basically what happened. I had Michigan ranked number 4 in the preseason, and I predicted them to finish second in the Big Ten East. In truth be told, second in the Big Ten overall by a mile. The Wolverines instead went 13-1. They finished first in the Big Ten East. They won the Big Ten and finished ranked number 3. They exceeded expectations, both from the national writers and from myself. I was much higher on Michigan than several people were, and I was slightly higher on Michigan than people at, the top media stations were. Most of them, they didn't have Michigan inside their preseason top 4, but they had them going 11-1 just because their weak non-conference schedule, their favorable conference schedule, which had Michigan State. And, they had Michigan State at home, Penn State at home, Nebraska at home. Their only tough road game was at Iowa. And most people, to be honest, knew from the preseason that Iowa's offense just likely didn't have the horses and the firepower to keep up with Michigan. Michigan, their season ended on a disappointing note, losing to TCU, but it was a 6-point loss. It was a game where Michigan played one of their bottom half games of the year by performances. I would probably call it one of the worst performances that I've seen Michigan play, combining this year and last year, having several turnovers, a quarterback who has been efficient and good for most of the year, throwing 2 pick sixes, Khalil Mullings fumbling at the goal line, and a defense that is one of the best in second half adjustments just getting destroyed. Michigan didn't respect TCU enough. They overlooked them, and to not give TCU any credit, they respected Michigan. They played one of their better games of the season against Michigan. They played before Georgia. They played the best team in college football. They played all year by a mile, and they beat them. So Michigan, let's just face it, despite the disappointing finish, according to Michigan fans and really the national world, who all picked Michigan to beat and destroy TCU, I'm guilty of that party, they won the Big Ten and they beat Ohio State. And they got 13 wins, which is a record for wins in a season. They had one of their best seasons in program history, possibly having their best regular season in program history. I mean, beating one of the best Ohio State teams in, I would say, the Ryan Day era, which is only 4 years, but I really think that 2022 team was better than the 2021 team and 2020 team, and they beat them by 22 points on the road. The Wolverines, if they just won that TCU game, and even if they lost to Georgia in the national title, I would have given them an A+, just because of all they achieved. But they do get an A here. Still an excellent grade, did an excellent job this year, and that's where I'm going to finish this video. If you liked it, I encourage you to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you around.